enthusiastic everybody is after this is over. So, I'd like to begin, first of all, with the title and begin my reflection from two different sources. One is a segment of my own experience having to do with the Cursillo, and the other is a citation from a noted Catholic historian. And I begin with the story with my experience of Cursillo, which now goes back more than 45 years. In those 45 years of my experience in this church movement, it's important to note that it's part of the church. And every chapter of church history has been enacted in the Cursillo, in my experience of it, except perhaps the Third Crusade and Pope Adrian in his saddle leading the troops of the Vatican against the forces of the French. So just about everything. So actually, it's the title that intrigues me, which is a fidelity that creates a future. Is there a fidelity that doesn't create a future? Because what we want, of course, is for our faithfulness to be able to leverage the challenges that we have for the future, all of which we know to be tremendous, and that we can bring the past and all of the wealth that we have of the past in our experience and move that into the future in a way that brings us the sort of confidence in knowing that whatever comes tomorrow or on the other side of the hill or on our trip to the horizon, we'll be able to meet. But is there a fidelity that doesn't create a future? And so this is one of my experiences in the Cursillo. So you arrive at the Cursillo, and it used to be, they would give you a little round leather tag with a little string on it so that you could write your name down on the tag, put it on so that everybody from the beginning knows you the way you want to be called. So if your name is Thomas and you want to be Tom, or if your name is Elizabeth and you want to be Liz, or if your name is Justice and you want to be known as Fred, you put down on your tag, what do you want to be known as? Pretty straightforward. Of course, people decorate their tags as the days go on, sometimes because they're having a good time, sometimes because they're bored, sometimes because they like to decorate. Well, it's all pretty straightforward, right? Everybody needs to know what somebody's name is. Now, there came a time, we've been doing this for 30 years, when one of the gals at the Women's Cursillo was really a gifted artist. And so she got her name tag. She was working, as part of the team. And so she did this little shadow picture of Jesus on her name tag. It's really, really amazing. You look at it and you notice it's one of those things where you have to focus for just a moment, and then the image jumps out at you. Well, she's sitting there at her table, and several people go, "Oh, that's really beautiful." She gets extra name tags, and she makes that little shadow picture of Jesus for them. Really astounding. So much so that one of the gals that she worked with at the following Cursillo wanted this available for not only for everybody at their table, but for everybody at the Cursillo. That's great. Everybody gets a little leather tag with the picture of Jesus on it. The problem, of course, is how do you tell what somebody's name is? Everybody has the same picture of the same time. And so what did they do? They went in, they printed name tags for everybody to wear. Well, okay. They printed name tags. It kind of short circuits the whole reason to have this little leather tag after all. It got to be the case that while this was never a tradition among the guys, since the gals did this, the guys would do this. And what they would do is, when you arrived at the Cursillo, they would give you a plastic name tag with your name on it, the one, John, Frederick, Justice, and put it on. And then they would give you the leather name tag, and eventually you would be able to put your name down, whatever that would be, probably on the second day. They would give you a chance to decorate your tag the way you wanted. Still a little odd. I mean, they give you a name tag to wear, and then they give you another name tag that you can replace the first name tag with. Kind of odd. It got to the point in the Spanish-speaking Cursillo, since that's what we were doing with the English-speaking. The Spanish-speaking would do this, although they would hand out the name tag that they printed for you and the leather one all at the same time. They didn't know why. They didn't know really where all this came from. It's what they did, at least what they saw in the English-speaking program. Well, okay. And this went on for a while until finally, eventually, we sort of said, time out. What's all this about? I mean, why two name tags? Why the focus on decoration? Why don't we just give them the name tag and have them write their name down? How about that? But the people who experienced this, that's what they experienced. They hadn't experienced anything else. And for this little segment, again, we've done hundreds of cursillos in the diocese. This is a tiny, tiny little segment. But for the people who experienced that, that's what they experienced. And they didn't experience anything different. And so they were doing what they thought you're supposed to do. I mean, we have this beautiful little picture, and now we have a name tag. And to interrupt and say, well, why do we have two name tags? Oh, this is a name tag, they asked? Thought it was a picture of Jesus. They were leveraging what they had experienced, sincerely wondering, why would we do anything different? And sincerely wondering, why this was a big deal at all, or a deal at all. In fact, they had never known that it wasn't like this. They thought that all of the complicated concerns that your name tag was an artistic canvas was the normal way of doing things. And eventually we had to say, the real fidelity to the original intent is that you have this little thing you can put on your around your neck. You don't have to take a pin and put it and ruin one of your shirts. Just wear this thing. Eventually is what we had to say. Now that's a silly little example, but it's a real thing. People only know what they know, right? And they only can leverage into the future what they have experienced from the past. And for those people whose experience was this little segment, that was as real and as authentic as all of the rest of us who had experienced 30 other years of this. So when they wanted to leverage their experience into the future, they did what we all do. They did this. Imagine that their experience was a yardstick. They just simply took the yardstick and flipped it into the future, right? That's the future for them. It's this much of the past into the future. Everybody does that. All of us. So when I grew up and made my first communion, Mass was in Latin. And when everything changed, I'm unable to communicate to the young seminarians today of what it was like to hear Mass in English for the first time. What this sounded like, because of course they've never experienced this. Now, they could experience having, heard Mass in Latin and then come back and experience it in English, but that no one had experienced this until then is the experience you can't recapture. So when because of the gift of my age, my yardstick is a lot longer, right? That I can flip into that. That's my experience. I can't ask them to flip their yardstick into the future with the same kind of leverage. And so when we talk about fidelity, it isn't simply the fact that we're asking people to be faithful. Those women and those people, the Cursillo movement for this segment, they were trying to be faithful to what they understood and what they had experienced. And what we were invited to do was to expand the range of their experience and ask them to understand that their experience fitted into a scale that was larger and into an experience that was more integral than this tiny little moment that they had experienced, which began with this particular woman whose name I still know. I've known her for 50 years now, who all she wanted to do was give a nice gift to the people at her table. That's all she wanted to do. Little did she know she was creating a revolution, at least a tiny revolution. Right? Okay. The second example comes from Paul Johnson. He's a respected Catholic historian who wrote, he's written a series of books, but he has a collection of essays that was published about 30 years ago. And it covers, respectably and decently, the transition of the papacy into, a player into the politics of Europe, the reforms of Gregory the Great, and the kind of anxiety that took place in the papacy through the 19th century as the church was attacked from everywhere. And so he finishes these really brilliant essays, and he has a final essay, and he says this. He said, look, given the kind of progress that we've made as a society in recognizing the gifts, the identity, and the value of women, it's only logical to presume that the church, in its responsible presence inside of society and as an authentic minister to society, to imagine that women ought to be ordained. Women taking their place in the human family, it's ultimately inevitable that this be the case. However, he said, when women are ordained, they ought to say Mass in Latin according to the Tridentine rite, wearing the vestments and the strict practices of the Tridentine liturgy. After all, that's what's really traditional in the church. Wait a minute. You know, the Tridentine Mass is 500 years old, or not ordaining women is a little older than that, right? Plus that kind of curious experience that I always am amazed by, that the oldest tradition in the church is to move from one language to the other to the other. After all, we moved from Aramaic to Greek to Latin, and then we stopped. And if what we want to do is the most traditional thing, then what we do is celebrate Mass in the language of the people, because that was the most traditional thing for about 700 years. And then other things happened. But for him, the experience of tradition is, well, we ordain the people that we acknowledge to be capable, but we also hold on to the tradition of doing this only in Latin. Well, we can talk about all those issues in another way, but the fact that for him, fidelity means to do something we have never done before, and then to not do anything that we haven't done before when it comes to how to celebrate Mass. Really interesting. Really interesting. And I point that out only because when we talk about fidelity, it's possible to focus on our experience and focus on those things that we acknowledge to be very important, and yet do it in a way and imagine a future that is not as robust and not as full as it might be. And so when the Pope sits down to write this letter as a reflection of what was going on in the Second Vatican Council, as what they wanted to do was to create a renewal of pastoral ministry and a renewal of the life of the priesthood, what they had in mind. And so the Pope is reflecting on those documents that were produced, and he's also reflecting on what Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict had to say about priestly formation and what priests are, what priestly response should be. And there's one other aspect about this that the Pope only mentions in one sentence, but I think something that we have to focus on. And I've mentioned this in several sermons before. But at the Second Vatican Council, the bishops were trying to face the challenges of the modern world. They were facing a couple of notable challenges that had come upon them in the late 50s and into the early 60s, as the transition from Pius XII to John the 23rd, and as they were looking out over Europe, now locked in the Cold War and the Soviet menace hovering just to the east, as well as the exploding populations of Africa, India, and Latin America, and trying to come to terms with what's happening there. They had a couple of other things that seemed to be more pressing. One was that in the Netherlands, there was this gigantic looming vocation crisis, as was the case in the Balkans. And they were wondering, what can we do in order for these very important Catholic places to be reinforced as they're leaning into a future that they don't understand and don't know how to respond to? What do we do? Well, as the bishops got together, they had a couple of things in mind, one of which was the renewal of the Catholic participation in an active life of the Scriptures. So they wanted to focus on the sustainment of the Catholic community in its deepest roots, was to renew our commitment to and our experience of Scripture. and that since we were facing a whole new kind of world that was being born among us, we reached that point in the early 60s where we tipped over into a world that were more urban than rural. You know, at the beginning of the 1900s, there were only 3 cities in the world that had more than 1 million people in them. And by 1960, there were something like 38 cities that had more than 1 million people in them. Unbelievable growth. And nobody knew what to do. And all of the warnings about how terrible everything's going to be, which we see every day, that was in 1960. Everybody was adverting to how terrible everything's going to be. Remember, we were all going to starve to death by 1990, when the world had 1/2 the number of people in it that it has today. And so, when the bishops gathered, they were talking about renewal of the scriptures, a renewal of pastoral vision and pastoral commitment, and a renewal of the excitement, the power of being able to spread the gospel joyfully. And what they wanted to do was to create the environment in which those things were experienced, and that would create this kind of fabulous renewal of priestly ministry. That's what all of the bishops in the country, in the world, had in mind. And what did we get? What we got was the sex abuse crisis, right? We knew that if we could renew the deepest foundations of priestly life, there would be an explosion of evangelization, vocational commitment, and pastoral renewal. And we get the suing of the church into bankruptcy everywhere in the world. What happened? What happened was the crisis of truth. Right? Not everything that was said about priest sex abuse was the whole truth, but what was said was the truth. This happened, and it happened without denial. I mean, it happened. We can't deny that it happened. Okay? If we're going to renew the priesthood in its fullest way, if we are going to have access to the power of the gospel, the spirit of truth, the evangelical energy that sustains the church, it has to be done, first of all, in truth. Now, if that had been said in 1963, when all of the bishops were gathered, all of them would have said yes. None of them would have had in mind what a renewal in truth looked like. Because none of them had in mind that this element of truth was the kind of thing the world apparently was waiting for, or maybe the priesthood was waiting for. But the renewal depends on the priestly ministry animated by the Spirit of Christ. That's what the bishops of the Second Vatican Council wrote. And focus on the Bible and apostolic ministry. But what we experienced was something completely out of our imagination. As Bishop Robert Barron said, he never really believed in the power of the devil the way people talked about it, until the experience of this kind of hit the awareness of people all around the world. And he found that the more you got into it, the more nested and complicated and evil it became, so that it was everywhere and nowhere. And it was everyone was responsible and no one responsible all at the same time, in all of the kind of same way. And our experience of it in Oklahoma has certainly been that way. Okay. So that when we start talking about what was going on as they wanted the life of the priesthood to be renewed, the fathers at the Second Vatican Council wanted this kind of renewed spirit. And in the course of these 60 years, of course, we've had the opportunity to reflect on what's essential, what about our present that we don't just flip into the future, but what in fact we understand to be and what we know to be the kind of fidelity to the things of our experience that will create the future that we really want. And there's a couple of those, of course, that are blindingly obvious and in every in every document, there is an adversion to that. The first of all is ongoing formation. Guys don't finish their education or their formation when they get out of the seminary. Or like a couple of guys, we used to joke about those old guys, who hadn't read a book since they left the seminary. And, I've run into guys not so old who were glad to know that now they've gotten ordained, they don't have to worry about reading books anymore. And it certainly shows. But of course, formation isn't just about reading books or going to conferences. Formation, as the Pope points out, is that formation has at its heart intimacy with the Lord. And to that extent, formation isn't accumulating degrees. It's not accumulating letters after your name or a larger name tag on your door or your desk. It's being conformed to, your intimacy with Christ, that your walk with Christ is something that is lively and informs your life. It's not simply the stuff that you know. And the one of the most important elements of that in this letter is one that John Paul wrote about over and over again, and one that I think priestly formation people, the folks in seminaries and things, don't focus on enough. And it's this, that the priest, first of all, has to be a joyful man, has to be joyful in his priesthood. And I am certainly among those who see guys who seem to scowl all the time, or who seem to be happy until they stand in the pulpit and scowl, who probably aren't getting that message quite as fully as they ought to. I was writing to one of our seminarians. In fact, I was at the Cursillo and I was listening to these talks, and I was writing a letter to him, and he had just he was from my parish at the time. He had just gone to the seminary. So I was really hopeful that he was experiencing seminary in the way I experienced, in the sense that that he was having a good time. I hoped it was something fun for him. And I wrote him and I said, the 6 years I spent in the seminary were 6 of the years that were the most fun I've ever had in my life. Now, that's not what often had been experienced in the seminary in the time previous to my time there, but it was. I had a fabulously good time in the seminary, surrounded by fabulously interesting and fun guys. What makes a seminary different than, say, going to OU? For the most part, you're surrounded by guys who are of above average intelligence, which means the stuff you can get into and the stuff you can go wrong with could be really something. But you can also have a really, really fun time together. And if I have time, I'll tell you about some stories of stuff that we did. But I had a fabulously good time. And he wrote back and he said, I was in college for 6 years, got a master's degree. I've had more fun the first 6 weeks in the seminary than I had my 6 years in college. God bless him. A joyful man, joyful in the priesthood. Not because, wow, look at all the fun stuff we get to do. Not just that. If you're in a seminary, how much fun stuff is there to do? Well, but that you are a joyful man. Not just a joyful priest, but that someone who's dedicated in the life of Christ, in your walk with Christ, that leads you into, or opens the door to, a life filled with the possibility of joy. And that is, I think, that is certainly one of the things that John Paul wanted to emphasize when it comes to human formation. If guys don't know how to be human beings, how are they going to talk to all of the world about a renewed humanity in Christ? If you haven't quite gotten to the point that you can live your life as a human being in the fullness of your humanity. The other element, and this is the one I think that sets this letter apart more than anything else, is his focus on listening. Now, he mentions that in 2 ways. He simply mentions that priests have to be focused on listening to their people, and then he talks about synodality, which is Pope Francis's way of emphasizing that the church has to be dedicated to listening to people, not just putting up with what people have to say, but structuring itself so that it's open to hearing what people say about their lives and about their situations in a way that it listens and then responds. You know, we all know the difference between the administrator who sits down and says, okay, tell me what's wrong, you know, and never hears a word because he's already decided what he's going to do. And the first thing he's going to do is never change anything because your complaining is just a giant pain in the rear, right? We all know what that's like. I've done that, my God, you know. I mean, how are you going to run a parish listening to everybody who complains? Well, that's it. I don't know. But Leo wants to has what he says in this letter is that the essence of priesthood is your identification with your people. You dispose yourself to be at their service, which means if you don't listen to them, you don't know how to serve them. You're not serving them if you've already decided, I'm not going to do this and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this. And my life is, my priestly life is that, and it's nothing else. You can't serve your people if you don't know them, and you can't know them if you don't listen to them. You can't accompany them if you don't hear what they have to say. You know, the great heroes, in my estimation, in our diocese were the ones who listened and responded. So, you know, nothing has affected our diocese more than our response to the Spanish-speaking and those who have arrived recently. And the priests who were the heroes in that were three guys who couldn't speak Spanish, right? But they responded because they saw all these people out there, but especially they saw the people who ought to be there who weren't, and they went out to where they were. And they began their sincere work. They were the ones outside of Oklahoma City, the ones many of the three guys I'm thinking of were never assigned in Oklahoma City. They were always out in the country. They were always in the second or third tier of guys in their abilities, but they were pioneers in making that happen in our diocese. Why? Because they listened. Because they were sincere in wanting to find out where the people are. Where are these people? And they went out and found them. And those three guys, those are the three guys I'm aware of. There may be 30 guys, but those three guys that I'm most aware of through the 1970s and into the 1980s have simply disappeared. You know, their names are, if they're mentioned, they're not mentioned for that, but their decisions made this diocese responsive to the Hispanic presence in a way that other dioceses are still today trying to keep up with because of them. They listened. Okay. So to that extent, the Pope wants to emphasize that this is a constitutive part of the priesthood. It's not an option. It's not what those particular guys just happen to do, or as so often happens in some of the ministries that we have, people value it as a sort of hobby. You know, some guys just like to be with their people instead of doing all the other things priests do. No, this is a constitutive part of the priesthood. You can't serve your people if you don't know them. You can't know them if you don't listen to them. And you can't listen to them unless you're ready to respond to them. And I know what it's like. You don't ask questions you don't want to get an answer to, right? I know, I know. But that's the essential of this. The Pope says this is the essential part of the vocation. You can't be a priest creating a fidelity, by whose fidelity creates a future, unless you're disposed to listening. Okay. And then the second thing about synodality, and you know, you would think that the Pope's emphasis on let's get people together so that they talk, so that we can listen, would cause such a stir. But of course, if you structure listening by saying we're going to listen and we're going to respond, we're not just going to say you can't say that, or who are you to say that the church isn't, or all of the things that we end up doing. We have to structure a way to listen, and then in listening, appreciate what's said, value what gets said, especially if we don't like it, and then structure a way to respond. Now, we may structure a response that's no, because what you're saying, for whatever reason, is we're not going to respond the way you're talking to us. But we have to have a way to listen and to know that the people who are talking are being heard, and a way to respond. That's what synodality is. I was down in Guadalajara a year ago, October. We went down to a clergy gathering down there, Father Joe Irwin and I, and we wanted to invite priests from Guadalajara to come up here and serve in Oklahoma. We were actually pretty successful in that we got 2 guys from Guadalajara to come up to serve in Oklahoma, although not the guys we actually talked to. They weren't, in fact, at that meeting, but we were down there. And they began, so in the Diocese of Guadalajara, there's something like 1,100 priests. So there were only like 600 of them there at this meeting. But they began with a little synodality report. And they asked a couple of really penetrating questions about people's experience, guys' experience. And they wanted the guys to talk about that. So we spent about 2 hours in these groups talking about our experience. It wasn't the kind of thing where everybody gives their report, that kind of thing. But questions were structured so that we had to say something about our experience with regard to this. It brought to the forefront, right, our need to respond to that kind of question. Now, I experienced that to be something really terrific. And it was a wonderful experience of the priesthood in Guadalajara. It was really amazing. I told Father Irwin that what the bishop, I have a lot of recommendations of what the bishop ought to do, but what the bishop ought to do is send us, we ought to be a part of that continuing education program they do down in Guadalajara, because it's really good. And then the guys who spoke to us over the couple of days that we were there were extraordinarily good. Extraordinarily good. So that we have to listen, that we accompany, that the minister of salvation is the minister who encounters the prospect of salvation as good news. He appropriates the good news in a life that's filled with joy, and that he accompanies his people with the authentic liberation of the gospel. Also, this is the first time I have read a letter about priestly formation and priestly attentiveness that also includes and celebrates and demands that priests be appreciative of the permanent diaconate. It is, we in Oklahoma, I've watched in Oklahoma as the permanent diaconate began with, we're going to do this. Nobody knows what a deacon is supposed to do. A deacon is the guy who gets ordained right before he becomes a priest. And we have no idea what these guys are going to do. And since we don't have any idea what they're going to do, basically what we do is ordain a bunch of guys and say, what are you guys going to do? Not bad, actually, because we left them alone for the most part, at least for the most part. And over the last 2 generations, we've watched this ministry become an integral part of the life of the church. As I said to somebody the other day, if you were to tell the people at St. Eugene's, we're going to do away with the diaconate, their experience would be, can you have a parish without a deacon? I mean, that's never been that. What do you mean, no deacons? What? Because that's an integral part of the life of the church in our experience. And the Pope says, if you priests don't appreciate what deacons can offer to you in your parish by way of their service and their dedication, their experience of the people, and their desire to be present to the needs of the people, then you guys are wasting your time, which I think is absolutely liberating, because The deacons are a part of the clerical life of the church. They are entrusted with this, with the work of the exercise of charity. And currently, we have diaconal service that ranges from, Deacon Norm, who that poor guy has to sit in his office 8 hours a day at the pastoral center. I can't think of anything worse than that. To our diocesan response to the prison ministry throughout the state is entrusted to, who is administered by and then administrated by a permanent deacon. I mean, it's those guys do tremendously important, tremendously good work. And the Pope says, listen to them. Be a part of their ministry. Accompany them. Have them accompany you. We're walking in the same direction. And that's groundbreaking. And then he says, you can't do this without your experience of the lay faithful. Obviously, anybody who thinks that priestly ministry is that, you get on your horse and you hoist the flag and then you charge toward the horizon by yourself hasn't been thinking about this very well. Our participation with the lay faithful isn't just kind of added on. It's integral to the life of the priesthood. And if that's not an integral part of the life of the priesthood, then we've violated the first understanding of what priestly ministry is, which is the priest is not by himself, but is woven into the life of the community. And as he is woven into the life of the community, that's what his priestly ministry is for. The priest is not all by himself. The vocation of solitariness is the only one, and the priesthood is not a vocation of being isolated, separate, and alone. And it is the priest who entrusts himself to the work of the Spirit is the priest who is integrated into the life of the community. And I think that's it's not revolutionary, but that emphasis, I think, is most important. And finally, he says, take up evangelizing, and he invites everybody, all the priests, to do that. And I know this is traditional too, but I always am challenged by it when I read it, which is take up the issue or the challenge of evangelization by way of your example of a modest life. And evangelize. Pope Francis had this in a kind of toss-off phrase in Evangelium Gaudii, where he said, Evangelium Gaudii. He said, evangelization should also contain within it a notion of spontaneity. That if it's simply a matter of making plans and then making sure that the plans get done, you've missed something, because the opportunity to proclaim the gospel also should include the opportunity for spontaneity and joy. So I always think of Philip waiting down at the stream as the eunuch from Candace's court in Ethiopia comes by. And so he looks up, his mind is 1,000 miles away, and he looks over and sees the eunuch read it, hears the eunuch reading, they read out loud, and he says, do you understand what you're reading? And the eunuch looks at him. He's riding in splendor in this coach, and there's Philip, walking along, who's a fisherman, and he says, how can I if there's no one to explain it to me? That spontaneous moment accounts for what? The evangelization of the country of Ethiopia. And so that kind of spontaneity can happen, which is an integral part of what it means to proclaim the gospel. Well, I mean, who knows, if we're interested in evangelization, we might even start, a radio program, something like that. So, So to sum up, the Pope's emphasis really isn't a whole list of something new. This isn't a kind of groundbreaking letter. He's summing up some of the concerns with regard to the church over the last 60 years, beginning with this notion of a renewal of the priesthood that was a preoccupation of the Second Vatican Council. And in the intervening years, the things that have been added, especially by John Paul and by Benedict. But he does invite us in our age to remain focused on what's really important. And I'll just, my final thing is, there are a couple of things he didn't say, right? He didn't say that fidelity and holding on to what we do today or what we did yesterday is the heart of making a future for the church tomorrow. Okay? There always is in every generation this notion, if we could just go back to the church of my grandfather, that would, because they were pious and they were faithful and they were holy then, if we could get back to then, we could make a future that would be beautiful. Well, there's some things about my grandparents' life that were beautiful and that were amazing. I don't want to do any of the things that they did. When the Oklahomans went to Guatemala, and I think it's in our little documentary, the infant mortality rate in Guatemala when the Oklahomans got there in 1963 was 40%. My mother grew up in OKC, and the infant mortality rate in her family was 35%. Babies died right and left all the time, and from accidents. Life on the frontier is rough, and I don't want to go back to their life. And besides, it would be impossible to go back to their life. Because why? Well, because it was 100 years ago. It's their life. It's not our life. So this notion that if we could just reform the practices, form again the practices that sustain them, we'll create a future where everything will be sustained. The Pope doesn't say that. Why? Well, because first of all, it's not possible. But second of all, the fidelity that creates a future is that what animated them to create those forms and that practices, the desire to evangelize, the desire to form a culture in the life of encounter with the good news of the gospel, that's what animated their lives and created the particular forms that they experience. That has to animate our lives, but it's going to create the particular forms that we need and that we experience. And it may look a lot like that. It may not look anything like that. After all, we're not making a living on 80 acres in OKC with 13 kids. So we're not doing that. We're doing something else. He doesn't say that. The second thing is there is no condemnation in this letter about how we live the life of the church today. No condemnation about the people who have dropped out or dropped away or who refuse to understand or who have just quit or left or condemned. That is not the emphasis of the life of the church in our time. The Second Vatican Council didn't condemn, one of the first councils that was focused almost entirely on the church's responsibility to respond, not to complain. And the Pope doesn't complain about what we haven't done. He invites us to what we can do and what we should do and what lies in front of us as what will animate us. And then the third thing, and that is that unless you can challenge, unless you can invite, unless you can say, the future that lies in front of us is a future that is a promise. Why would anyone want to go there? Now we can say everything that you're familiar with is going to change. I've often fantasized what it would have been like to go to a clergy meeting in Oklahoma in 1960, or maybe even better, 1970, and start revealing what 2025 would look like from 1970. There would be a whole lot of things nobody would believe. I mean, you could hardly believe between 2000 and 2025, much less 1970 to 2025. But it's everything that you presume is going to change. What in the crisis of truth that we live in, right? Every opportunity that we could respond to last generation is going to be foreclosed to us. But we're going to live a life where there are opportunities that you can't imagine that are going to be like low-hanging fruit that are going to drop down right in front of us. Our revolution with regard to communication, for example, or travel. My God, what we can do now is unimaginable, even from 30 years ago. And so the life, the greatest and most opportune experience to make the gospel real and alive in the lives of people are going to come to us in a way we can't imagine now, but they're going to lie there in the future, whether that's 30 years from now or tomorrow. And what we're asking everyone to do is to remain faithful, to keep their eyes open, and to ask this question until it's answered, which is, here I am, Lord. I come to do your will. Where should I go? What am I to do? What am I to do now? We all forget Father Pruitt, how old was Ignatius when he went off to the university, when he had his experience going to Manresa? 30? About 30. Yeah. He wasn't 12, he wasn't 17, he wasn't 21. He was 30 years old, and he began. He ended up at the University of Paris. The spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, one of the most famous spiritual works in the history of the church, was written in terrible Latin and terrible Spanish. He misspelled every other word, and he got all of the ending cases in Latin wrong because he was a terrible student. He didn't start till he was 30 years old to go to school. He wrote all these letters and misspelled everything. Brilliant. I mean, genius. But a genius who got started about the time when all the great work usually is done. And so, the Pope's invitation is that if we focus on a future with fidelity that creates a future, then we're responding to the invitation that Christ is at the center of how we live and how we respond, and that Christ and Christ's accompaniment of us into the future is what creates the fidelity for the future. And so that's the Pope's insight. Read the letter. It's good.